The county sealed Darrow's Cave on the 11th of March, 1856, and by the 12th, everyone in Boone Creek, Arkansas, had an opinion about it. The opinions were unanimous. Good riddance. The cave had been nothing but trouble since the flood of February, when 3 weeks of rain turned the White River into a brown, churning serpent that swallowed bottomland, drowned livestock, and sent water pouring into every low-lying opening in the Ozark Hills. Darrow's Cave, set into a limestone bluff a quarter-mile above the river, had taken the flood like a throat takes water, gulping it in through fissures and sinkholes that no one had mapped, channeling it through passages that no one had explored, and then, on the night of February 23rd, vomiting it back out in a torrent that carved a new channel down the hillside and deposited 6 inches of gray mud across Elmer Poole's tobacco field. Poole wanted the cave sealed. The county judge, a cautious man named Hargrove who owed Poole money, agreed. A crew of 4 men spent 2 days hauling limestone blocks from a nearby quarry and mortaring them across the cave's mouth, a rough wall, 8 feet wide and 6 feet tall, with no door and no window. They mixed the mortar thick and let it cure in the cold March air, and when they were finished, the cave was gone. Not destroyed, of course. You cannot destroy a cave, but erased from the landscape, hidden behind a wall of stone that looked, after a season of weathering, like the bluff itself had healed over a wound. Nobody mourned the loss. Darrow's Cave had never been worth anything to anyone. Old Silas Darrow, who had homesteaded the ridge above it in 1819, had used the entrance as a root cellar until a copperhead bit his youngest daughter there in 1831, and he sealed it with timber. The timber rotted. The cave reopened. Boys dared each other to enter it. A pig wandered in once and was never found. The flood of 1856 was simply the final insult, the cave's last attempt to remind the people of Boone Creek that it existed, and their definitive response: a wall and forgetting. Emmett Sayers watched them build the wall. He was 31 years old, lean and sun-darkened, with the kind of quiet face that people's eyes slid over without registering. He stood on the ridge above the bluff, half hidden by a stand of post oaks, and watched the men work. He said nothing. He had learned, over 3 decades of being the person nobody listened to, that silence was more useful than speech. Emmett was the youngest of 4 brothers born to Abel and Ruth Sayers of Carroll County. Abel had been a blacksmith, a good one, respected, with hands like shovels and a voice that could bend iron on its own. His 3 eldest sons had inherited his build and his trade. They were large, loud, confident men who swung hammers and spoke their minds and married women who bore them children with the regularity of seasons. They were, in the language of the Ozarks, substantial. Emmett was not substantial. He was narrow-shouldered and slight, with his mother's thin wrists and a habit of reading that his father considered a character flaw on par with drinking or gambling. He could shoe a horse. Abel had made certain of that. But his hands were better suited to smaller work: whittling, drawing, the delicate repair of watches and instruments that people brought to the shop when the real smiths were busy. His brothers called him the Runt, without malice, the way you might name a small dog. It was simply what he was. When Abel died in the winter of 1853, the shop and the house went to the eldest brother, Orrin. The tools went to the second brother, Marcus. The savings, what little there were, went to the third brother, Jesse. Emmett received a saddle, a hunting rifle, and his mother's collection of books, which comprised 11 volumes, a Bible, a farmer's almanac from 1847, 2 novels by Mr. Cooper, a water-stained copy of Humboldt's Views of Nature that Ruth had acquired from a traveling bookseller and read until the spine cracked, and 6 issues of a magazine called The Western Journal and Civilian that contained articles on geology, agriculture, and the natural sciences. It was Humboldt that had ruined Emmett, or saved him, depending on your perspective. He had read Views of Nature at the age of 14 and had never fully recovered. The book described a world of underground rivers, volcanic forces, mineral veins, and interconnected natural systems that operated beneath the surface of things. Literally beneath the surface, underground, in the dark places where most people never looked. Emmett had not known, before Humboldt, that the earth had an interior life. After Humboldt, he could not stop thinking about it. He had explored Darrow's Cave twice before the flood. The first time at 19, he had gone in alone with a pine knot torch and penetrated perhaps 40 yards before the passage narrowed and his nerve failed. Second time, at 26, he had gone better prepared, with a lantern, a coil of rope, and a compass, and had reached a point roughly 80 yards from the entrance where the main passage split into 3. He had taken the leftmost passage, followed it for another 30 yards, and encountered a wall of flowstone that blocked further progress. The air beyond the flowstone, he noticed, was warmer than the air in the main passage, and it carried a smell he could not identify, clean and mineral, like wet stone after rain, but with something else underneath, something that made him think of depth. He had planned a third expedition. The flood had intervened, and now the cave was sealed. Emmett watched the last mortar dry. He watched the work crew gather their tools and descend the hill. He watched the March wind push clouds across the ridge, and he thought about what lay behind that wall. Passages he had not followed, chambers he had not entered, and that strange warm air that smelled of something he could not name. He did not make a decision that day. Decisions, for Emmett, were not sudden things. They were slow accumulations, like the mineral deposits that built up on cave walls, layer by layer, invisible in their forming, but eventually substantial enough to change the shape of a room. By the end of March, the accumulation was complete. He was going to open the cave. He did not do it immediately. Emmett was not impulsive. He was, if anything, excessively deliberate, a quality that his brothers interpreted as timidity, and that was, in truth, something closer to strategy. He spent April preparing. He took work as a carpenter's assistant in Boone Creek, earning enough to purchase supplies: a proper miner's lantern with a reflector, 200 feet of hemp rope, a geological hammer, a cold chisel, iron spikes, a canvas pack, candles, a tinderbox, a canteen, and, his most expensive acquisition, a mercury thermometer in a leather case, ordered from a scientific supplier in St. Louis. The thermometer cost $4, which was more than Emmett earned in a week. He considered it an investment. He also spent April studying. He reread his mother's copy of Humboldt. He visited the lending library in Harrison, 20 miles to the north, and read everything he could find about caves, their formation, their hydrology, their connection to underground water systems. He learned that limestone caves were formed by the slow dissolution of rock by slightly acidic groundwater, a process that took thousands of years and created networks of passages, chambers, and underground streams that could extend for miles beneath the surface. He learned that caves breathed, that differences in air pressure between the surface and the interior caused air to flow in and out of cave entrances, and that the temperature and humidity of this air could reveal information about the size and depth of the cave system. He learned that the Ozark Plateau, on which he stood, was one of the most cave-dense regions in North America, riddled with caverns and sinkholes and underground rivers that the surface world knew nothing about. He learned, in other words, that the earth beneath his feet was hollow, and that the hollow places held secrets. On the night of May 3rd, 1856, Emmett Sayers climbed the bluff to Darrow's cave. The moon was a thin crescent, and the woods were dark and loud with spring peepers. He carried his pack, his tools, and a determination that sat in his chest like a stone. The mortar wall was solid but not expert. The men who had built it were laborers, not masons, and they had worked quickly in cold weather. Emmett examined the wall by touch, running his fingers along the joints, feeling for weaknesses. He found one near the top, a section where the mortar had not fully bonded with the surrounding limestone, leaving a gap he could work a chisel into. He worked for 3 hours. The chisel rang against stone in the darkness, a sound he muffled as best he could by wrapping the chisel head in leather. He removed blocks one at a time, stacking them neatly to the side, working with the careful patience of a man dismantling something he intended to reassemble. By midnight, he had opened a gap large enough to crawl through, roughly 2 feet wide and 18 inches tall, near the top of the wall. He squeezed through. The cave exhaled against his face, a warm, damp breath that carried that same mineral smell he remembered. He was inside. He resealed the opening from within, restacking the blocks loosely so that they would appear intact from outside, but could be removed quickly from within. Then he lit his lantern, shouldered his pack, and began to walk. The main passage was, as he remembered it, wide enough for 2 men, with a ceiling that rose and fell like the breathing of a sleeping animal. The floor was littered with debris from the flood, dried mud, broken branches, the carcass of a raccoon that had been carried in by the water and left behind when it receded. The walls were streaked with watermarks, dark lines that showed how high the flood had risen. In places, the water had reached the ceiling. Emmett moved slowly, reading the cave the way a hunter reads a forest, by signs, by patterns, by the things that were present and the things that were absent. The flood had changed the cave. Passages that had been dry were now coated with silt. Formations that had taken centuries to build had been scoured clean or broken off entirely. The cave's floor, once a map of footprints and animal tracks, was now a blank slate of dried mud. But the air was the same, warm, moving, alive. He reached the junction where the passage split into 3. On his previous visit, he had taken the left passage and encountered the flowstone wall. This time, he paused and held his lantern at each opening in turn, watching the flame. At the left passage, the flame flickered slightly. A gentle pull of air, as before. At the center passage, the flame held steady, dead air, a passage that went nowhere or that was blocked. At the right passage, the flame bent sharply toward the opening, guttering and dancing. Strong airflow. The cave was breathing through this passage, pulling air from the entrance and sending it deep into the earth. Emmett had not taken the right passage before. It had seemed too narrow, barely shoulder width, and too steep, descending at an angle that promised difficulty. But the airflow told him what his eyes could not. This passage went somewhere significant. A cave breathes in proportion to its volume. Strong airflow meant large spaces deeper in. He turned right. The passage descended steeply for perhaps 50 yards. Emmett braced himself against the walls, his boots sliding on wet limestone, his lantern swinging and throwing wild shadows. The air grew warmer with each step, not uncomfortably so, but noticeably, the way you notice the warmth of a house when you step in from the cold. The mineral smell intensified. The passage narrowed further. At one point, Emmett had to turn sideways and edge through a gap barely 12 inches wide, the stone pressing against his chest and back simultaneously, his lantern held at arm's length ahead of him. He could feel the air rushing past him through the gap, warm and insistent, like the breath of something enormous waiting on the other side. He squeezed through, and the world opened up. The chamber was vast. Emmett's lantern, which had adequately illuminated the passages behind him, now threw its light into a darkness so large that the beam simply disappeared, swallowed by distance. He could not see the ceiling. He could not see the far wall. He could see the floor extending ahead of him for perhaps 20 feet before it ended, not at a wall, but at an edge. He approached the edge carefully, testing each step. The floor was smooth limestone, damp but solid. At the edge, it dropped away into nothing. A cliff, he realized, an underground cliff that fell straight down into darkness. Emmett lay on his stomach and held his lantern over the edge. Below him, perhaps 30 feet down, he saw water. Not a puddle, not a pool, not the remnant of a flood. A lake. The water was black in the lantern light, but when he adjusted the reflector and sent the beam downward at an angle, the blackness resolved into clarity. The water was not dark but transparent, so clear that its surface was nearly invisible, and what he had taken for blackness was simply depth. He was looking through the water to a bottom that was very far below. The lake filled the chamber from wall to wall. Emmett could see, at the limits of his lantern's reach, the far shore, perhaps 200 feet away. The chamber was shaped like a bowl, with the cliff where he lay forming one rim, and the walls curving down on either side to meet the water. The ceiling, which he could now faintly see by the reflected light from the water's surface, arched perhaps 40 feet above the lake, a natural dome of pale limestone studded with stalactites that hung like the pipes of an organ. The water was still, perfectly, absolutely still. No current, no ripple, no movement of any kind. It lay in its stone basin like glass in a frame, reflecting the stalactites above so perfectly that the chamber seemed to double. The real ceiling above and its phantom twin below, separated by a membrane of water so clear it was almost invisible. Emmett dipped his hand in. The water was warm, noticeably warm, like bath water that had been drawn an hour ago. He brought his hand to his mouth and tasted it. Fresh, clean, not a trace of salt or sulfur or the metallic tang of mineral springs. It was the purest water he had ever tasted, cold spring sweet, without the earthy taste of surface water or the flatness of well water. It tasted, he thought, the way water was supposed to taste before anything touched it. Primordial water. Water that had never seen sunlight. He sat at the edge of the cliff for a long time, his lantern beside him, staring at the lake. His hands were trembling, and he did not know whether it was from the exertion of the descent or from the magnitude of what he was seeing. An underground lake, a body of fresh water that no human being had ever seen, fed by sources he could not identify, contained in a chamber that the surface world did not know existed. He thought of Humboldt. He thought of the underground rivers that Humboldt had described in South America, flowing through caverns that no map recorded, supplying springs that surfaced miles from their source. He thought of the Ozark Plateau, its limestone honeycombed with passages, its surface dotted with springs that people used without ever asking where the water came from. This was where the water came from, or at least, this was part of the answer. This lake was a node in a network, a reservoir in an underground system that collected, stored, and distributed water through the limestone like blood through a body's veins. Emmett took out his thermometer. The air in the chamber registered 78 degrees. 20 degrees warmer than the May night above. The water, when he lowered the thermometer on a string, registered 72 degrees at the surface. He had no way to measure its depth, but he estimated, from the clarity of the water and the distance he could see into it, that the lake was at least 40 feet deep at its center, possibly much more. He made notes. He sketched the chamber as best he could by lantern light. The dimensions approximate, the proportions guessed at, but the essential features captured. The entry cliff, the oval shape of the lake, the domed ceiling, the stalactites. He noted the air temperature, the water temperature, the direction and strength of the airflow that entered the chamber from the passage behind him and exited. Where? He could not tell. The air seemed to rise, drawn upward through fissures in the ceiling that he could hear but not see, a faint whistle of moving air in the darkness overhead. He stayed for 4 hours. When he finally turned back, crawling through the narrow gap and ascending the steep passage, he moved like a man in a trance, not dazed, but concentrated, every sense focused inward on the memory of what he had seen. The lake, the water, the warmth, the silence. He emerged from the cave at dawn, resealed the wall, and walked home through a world that looked, after the cave's darkness, intolerably bright and cluttered and loud. Emmett did not tell anyone about the lake. This was not secrecy so much as self-preservation. He knew what Boone Creek would do with the information. They would dismiss it, or mock it, or, worst of all, exploit it. Elmer Poole would see it as a threat to his tobacco field. Judge Hargrove would see it as a legal complication. Emmett's brothers would see it as further evidence that the runt had lost his mind, crawling into sealed caves in the middle of the night to stare at puddles. Purpose was a stronger medicine than rest. Emmett had something to work toward now, something that organized his days and gave weight to his hours. He returned to the cave every 3 or 4 nights through May and June, always entering and leaving in darkness, always resealing the wall behind him. Each visit, he pushed his exploration further. He found a way down the cliff, a series of natural ledges on the chamber's eastern wall that formed a rough staircase to the water's edge. He waded in. The bottom was smooth limestone, covered with a thin layer of fine sediment that puffed up around his ankles like flour. The water deepened gradually for the first 20 feet, then dropped off sharply. He could not swim. Few men on the frontier could. But he waded as far as he dared, the warm water rising to his waist, then his chest, the lantern held high above his head. At chest depth, he looked down and saw the bottom falling away beneath him into blue-black nothing, and he felt a vertigo that had nothing to do with height and everything to do with depth, the particular dizziness of standing above an abyss rather than beside one. He retreated to the shallows and explored the lake's perimeter instead. The chamber was roughly oval, as he had guessed, but not symmetrical. The eastern wall curved more sharply than the western, and in the southwestern corner, the wall was not solid stone, but a jumble of boulders and collapsed rock that suggested a passage had once existed there, now blocked by an ancient rockfall. On the northern shore, the far side from his entry point, he found the lake's inlet. A stream of water, no wider than his arm, emerged from a low opening in the rock and flowed into the lake with a sound so soft it was almost subliminal. The water was warm, warmer than the lake itself, perhaps 80 degrees, and it carried a faint sulphurous tinge that the lake water lacked. Geothermal, Emmett thought, though he did not know the word. The earth was heating this water somewhere far below, and sending it upward through the rock. On the southern shore, near the base of the cliff where he had first entered, he found the outlet. Or rather, he found where an outlet should have been. A narrow channel, carved into the limestone floor, led away from the lake and disappeared into the southern wall. But the channel was dry. The flood, Emmett realized, had disrupted the lake's drainage. Silt and debris had blocked the outlet, and the lake's level had risen. He could see the water line on the walls, a fresh mark several inches above the old one. The lake was slowly filling. This explained the flood's effect on the surface. The water that had poured out of Darrow's cave and across Poole's tobacco field had not come from the rain alone. It had come from this lake, which had overflowed when its outlet was blocked, sending water back up through the passages and out the cave's mouth. The cave had not attacked Poole's field. It had been trying to breathe. Emmett began to understand the system. The lake was a reservoir fed by a geothermal spring from below and drained by an underground channel to the south. Under normal conditions, the inflow and outflow balanced, and the lake remained stable, a hidden body of water, unknown and undisturbed, maintaining itself in the darkness with the patient self-regulation of a living thing. The flood had upset that balance by blocking the outlet, and the lake had responded the only way it could, by rising until it found a new path to the surface. If the outlet could be cleared, the lake would stabilize. The flooding would stop, and Poole's tobacco field would be safe, not because the cave had been sealed, but because the cave's internal plumbing had been repaired. Emmett had a solution to a problem that the county did not know it had. The question was whether anyone would listen. They did not listen. Not at first. Emmett went to Judge Hargrove in June with a carefully written account of his findings: the lake, its dimensions, its inlet and outlet, his theory about the flood's cause. Hargrove read the document with the expression of a man being shown a drawing by a child. He then asked Emmett how he had gotten into the sealed cave, and when Emmett explained, Hargrove's expression shifted from indulgence to irritation. "You broke into a county-sealed structure," Hargrove said. "That's a violation, Mr. Sayers." "The cave isn't a structure, Your Honor. It's a geological formation. The wall is a structure. The cave was there before anyone built anything. Don't play word games with me, son. I could fine you." "You could, but it wouldn't fix the flooding." Hargrove dismissed him. Emmett went next to Elmer Poole, reasoning that the man most affected by the flooding would be most interested in a permanent solution. Poole listened for approximately 90 seconds before interrupting. "You want me to believe there's a lake under my field?" "Not under your field, under the bluff a quarter-mile south. But the drainage channel runs in the direction of your field. If it's blocked, I don't care about drainage channels. The cave is sealed. The flooding stopped. Problem solved. The flooding stopped because the water level in the lake is dropping. When the spring refills it, and it will, the same thing will happen. The outlet is still blocked." Poole looked at him, the way Emmett's brothers looked at him, with a mixture of pity and exasperation reserved for people who see problems where none exist. "You Sayers boys," he said. "Orrin got the sense, Marcus got the muscle, Jesse got the charm. What did you get, Emmett?" "The books," Emmett said. "That's about right." Emmett left. He did not try a third audience. He had learned from a lifetime of being the runt that persuasion was not his gift. His gift was patience. His gift was the willingness to work in the dark, alone, on problems that no one else could see, until the evidence was so overwhelming that even Elmer Poole would have to acknowledge it. He went back to the cave. Through the summer and autumn of 1856, Emmett worked on the blocked outlet. It was brutal, solitary labor, crawling into a passage barely large enough to admit his body, chipping at compacted silt and stone with a hand chisel, dragging the debris out bucket by bucket. The passage extended 12 feet into the southern wall before he reached the blockage, a plug of flood-deposited clay, gravel, and broken flowstone that filled the channel completely. He worked by lantern light, in heat that never dropped below 75 degrees, in air that was thick with moisture and the smell of disturbed earth. His clothes rotted. His boots fell apart. He developed a cough from the dust and a permanent ache in his shoulders from the cramped posture. He lost weight. His brother Orrin, whom he saw at the general store in July, asked if he was sick. "I'm working," Emmett said. "Working at what?" "A project." Orrin shook his head. "You and your projects." Emmett did not elaborate. He bought supplies, more candles, more rope, a new pair of boots, and returned to the cave. The work taught him things about himself that 31 years of living had not. It taught him that endurance was not a quality you possessed, but a practice you performed, that you did not wake up one morning with enough patience to clear 12 feet of compacted stone, but rather you cleared 1 inch and then another inch, and the patience accumulated like the inches, each one making the next one possible. It taught him that loneliness and solitude were different things, that loneliness was the absence of connection, while solitude was the presence of purpose, and that a man alone in a cave with a chisel and a clear objective was less lonely than a man in a crowded room with nothing to do. It taught him, most importantly, that the earth rewarded those who worked with it rather than against it. The blockage was not his enemy. It was simply material in the wrong place, and his job was not to fight it, but to move it, patiently, respectfully, one handful at a time, until the water could flow where it was meant to flow. By October, he had cleared 8 feet of the 12-foot blockage. The work was getting easier as he went, the compacted material giving way to looser fill that he could scoop by hand. On the night of October 14th, he broke through the last of it, and the lake's water, which had been pressing against the blockage with the patient insistence of a held breath, surged into the cleared channel and began to flow. The sound was extraordinary. After months of silence, the cave filled with the voice of moving water, a rushing, musical sound that echoed through the chamber and up through the passages until it seemed like the entire cave was singing. The lake's surface, which had been glass still for as long as Emmett had known it, began to move, a slow, gentle current drawing toward the outlet, carrying the surface dust in tiny fragments of limestone toward the southern wall and away. Emmett sat on the shore and watched the water flow. The lake level was dropping, slowly, almost imperceptibly, but dropping. The system was healing itself, the way a body heals a wound once the obstruction is removed. He came back the next night. The water level had dropped 3 inches. The night after that, another 2. By the end of the week, the lake had settled at a level roughly 6 inches below the old water line, a new equilibrium, slightly lower than before the flood, but stable. The outlet flowed steadily. The inlet continued its warm, gentle contribution from below. The balance was restored. The cave had stopped holding its breath. The validation Emmett had not sought came to him anyway, carried on the current of events. The following February, almost exactly a year after the flood of 1856, the rains returned. 3 weeks of steady downpour saturated the hills, swelled the White River, and sent water pouring into every low-lying depression in the county. The conditions were identical to the previous year's flood. Poole's field did not flood. The water that had, 12 months earlier, poured from the sealed cave mouth and across the tobacco rows now flowed instead through the cleared outlet channel into the underground drainage system, and eventually, Emmett would later trace its path to a spring that emerged 2 miles to the south, well away from any cultivated land. The cave's plumbing worked. The lake absorbed the excess water, the outlet carried it away, and the surface remained dry. Poole noticed. He could not help but notice. His neighbor's fields flooded, his did not. He asked questions. The questions led eventually to Emmett. "You did something to that cave," Poole said, standing in Emmett's rented room above the carpenter's shop, his hat in his hands, his tone caught between accusation and gratitude. Emmett explained. He showed Poole his notes, his sketches, his temperature records. He described the lake, the inlet, the blocked outlet, the clearing work. He described the underground drainage system that connected the lake to the spring 2 miles south. He described, as simply and clearly as he could, the hydrological cycle that the cave represented. Water rising from deep geothermal sources, collecting in a subterranean reservoir, and draining through limestone channels to the surface. Poole listened. He listened longer than he had listened in June, because the evidence was no longer theoretical. It was standing in his unflowed field. "You're telling me," Poole said slowly, "that there's a lake under that bluff that controls the water table for half the county. I'm telling you that the cave is not a nuisance. It's infrastructure, the most important infrastructure in Boone Creek, and it's been here for 100,000 years." Poole was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Show me." Emmett led Elmer Poole into the cave on a Saturday morning in late February 1857. They brought 2 lanterns, a rope, and, at Emmett's insistence, the mercury thermometer. The journey from the entrance to the lake chamber took 45 minutes. Poole, who was a large man unaccustomed to crawling through narrow passages, cursed steadily for most of it. But when they emerged into the great chamber and Emmett held his lantern over the cliff's edge, Poole fell silent. The lake lay below them, vast and clear and still. The lantern light penetrated the water to a depth of 15 or 20 feet, revealing the smooth limestone bottom and the subtle contours of the underwater terrain. The ceiling above reflected in the surface like a second sky. The warm air wrapped around them like a blanket. Poole stared for a long time. "How big is it?" he finally asked. "About 200 feet long and 100 wide, 40 feet deep at the center at least. I haven't been able to measure the deepest part. And it's been here the whole time. Longer than the whole time. It's been here since before there were people in these hills. The cave formed it. The spring feeds it. The outlet drains it. It's a system." Poole knelt at the edge and dipped his hand in the water. He tasted it. His eyes widened. "That's the cleanest water I've ever put in my mouth. It's filtered through 300 feet of limestone. There's nothing in it but water." They descended to the shore. Emmett showed Poole the inlet spring, the cleared outlet channel, the waterline marks that recorded the lake's fluctuation during the flood. He explained the geology as best he could, the geothermal source, the limestone filtration, the convection currents that kept the water circulating and clean. Poole listened with the focused attention of a man who has just discovered that something he dismissed as worthless is in fact essential. "This is a water supply," Poole said, "for the whole valley. It could be, if it's managed properly. And you cleared the drainage yourself. Alone." "I did." Poole looked at Emmett, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" "I did tell someone. I told you. You didn't listen. Poole had the grace to look uncomfortable. I suppose I didn't. Word spread. As word does. Poole told Judge Hargrove. Hargrove, who had threatened Emmett with a fine, now requested a formal tour. He brought 2 county commissioners and a land surveyor named Dalton, who had some knowledge of geology. All 4 men descended into the cave, stood on the cliff above the lake, and experienced the same sequence of emotions: disbelief, wonder, and then, because they were practical men, calculation. The lake was a resource. Boone Creek had been growing, slowly, in the way that Ozark towns grew, but growing, and water was becoming a concern. The White River flooded in wet years and shrank in dry ones. The wells on the plateau were shallow and unreliable. The springs that fed the local creeks varied with the seasons, but the underground lake, fed by a geothermal source and insulated from surface conditions by 300 feet of limestone, was stable. Its temperature varied by less than 2 degrees year-round. Its flow was constant. Its water was pure. Hargrove asked Emmett if he would be willing to serve as the cave's custodian, a formal position with a small salary, responsible for maintaining the passages, monitoring the lake's level, and managing access. Emmett said yes. It was, he reflected, the first time anyone had offered him a job that used the skills he actually possessed. He moved into a cabin he built at the base of the bluff, 50 yards from the cave entrance. He dismantled the mortar wall and replaced it with a proper wooden door, set in a frame of hewn oak, with a lock to which he held the only key. He widened the most difficult passages, installed rope handrails along the steep descent, and built a small wooden platform at the cliff's edge, where visitors could stand and look down at the lake. And he kept records, daily records, meticulous and precise, in leather-bound notebooks that he purchased with his first month's salary. Water temperature, air temperature, lake level, measured by a graduated stick he drove into the shallows. Airflow direction and strength, estimated by the behavior of a candle flame at the passage junction. Rainfall on the surface, correlated with changes in the lake's level. He was, without knowing it, conducting one of the first systematic hydrological studies of an underground water system in the Ozarks. It was the records that brought Dr. Joseph Meigs to Boone Creek in the autumn of 1858. Meigs was a professor of natural philosophy at the College of Arkansas in Fayetteville, a tall, bearded man with the restless energy of a terrier and a particular interest in the hydrology of the Ozark Plateau. He had heard about the cave from Dalton, the land surveyor, who had mentioned it in a letter to a colleague, who had mentioned it to Meigs. The chain of information was long and indirect, but it ended with Meigs arriving in Boone Creek on a mule, carrying a trunk full of scientific instruments and a letter of introduction that no one in town could read because it was written in Latin. Emmett could read it. It was a passage from Pliny the Elder, describing underground rivers. He decided he liked Meigs. They spent 2 weeks together in the cave. Meigs brought instruments that Emmett had only read about: a hydrometer for measuring water density, a set of graduated cylinders, litmus papers for testing acidity, and a device called a current meter that measured the speed of flowing water. Together, they mapped the lake with a precision that Emmett's solo efforts had not achieved. They measured its depth, 63 feet at the deepest point, far deeper than Emmett had estimated. They measured the inlet flow, approximately 2 gallons per minute, remarkably constant. They measured the outlet flow and found it matched the inlet almost exactly, confirming that the lake was in equilibrium. They sampled the water and tested it for mineral content, finding it extraordinarily pure, low in dissolved solids, neutral in pH, and free of the bacterial contamination that plagued surface water sources. "Mr. Sayers," Meigs said, sitting on the wooden platform above the lake, his instruments spread around him like the tools of some arcane trade. "You have discovered something of genuine scientific importance." Emmett poured coffee from the pot he had carried down. "I didn't discover it. It was always here. You discovered it to the world, which is the only kind of discovery that matters, scientifically speaking." Meigs looked at the lake, his eyes reflecting the lantern light. "This is a karst aquifer, an underground reservoir formed by the dissolution of limestone over geological time. The geothermal inlet suggests a connection to deep crustal water that has been underground for thousands of years, heated by the Earth's internal warmth and filtered through hundreds of feet of rock. The purity of the water is exceptional. I have tested springs across the Ozarks, and none approach this quality." "What does that mean, practically?" "It means this lake is a natural water purification system of extraordinary efficiency. The limestone filters out sediment and contaminants. The geothermal temperature inhibits bacterial growth. The enclosed environment prevents contamination from surface runoff. You have, in effect, a reservoir that cleans itself." Emmett thought about Poole's tobacco field. He thought about the mortar wall. He thought about the county's decision to seal the cave, to wall off, out of ignorance and annoyance, a resource that was more valuable than every tobacco field in the county combined. "They sealed it because it flooded a field," Emmett said. "They sealed it because they didn't understand it," Meigs said, "which is the same reason people have destroyed remarkable things since the beginning of time." Meigs published a paper in 1859 in the Transactions of the Academy of Natural Sciences, describing the cave and its underground lake. The paper was detailed, rigorous, and generous. Meigs credited Emmett as the lake's discoverer and the primary collector of the hydrological data. He named the lake Sayers Lake over Emmett's protests. The paper attracted attention, not the explosive overnight kind scientific papers rarely do, but a slow, steady accumulation of interest from geologists, hydrologists, and, increasingly, engineers. The Civil War interrupted this interest, as it interrupted most things, but by the late 1860s, visitors began arriving in Boone Creek with increasing frequency. They came to see the lake, to test the water, to study the cave's unique hydrology, and to consult with Emmett, who had by then accumulated 12 years of continuous data on the system's behavior. Emmett received them all with the same quiet courtesy. He led them into the cave, answered their questions, shared his records, and offered coffee on the platform above the lake. He did not seek attention or credit. He was content to be what he had always been, the observer, the recorder, the man who saw what others overlooked and had the patience to document it. It was during one of these visits, in the spring of 1864, that Emmett met Catherine Fry. She arrived with her uncle, a pharmacist from Little Rock named Gerhard Fry, who had read Meigs's paper and wanted to test the cave water for potential medicinal properties. Catherine was 27, the daughter of Gerhard's late brother, a school teacher who had died of typhoid in 1861. She had her father's profession. She taught reading and arithmetic to children in Little Rock, and her uncle's scientific curiosity. She wore practical clothes, asked precise questions, and carried a notebook in which she wrote observations in a hand so small and neat it looked like printed text. She was the first person Emmett had ever met who, upon seeing the lake, did not gasp or exclaim or fall silent. Instead, she knelt at the water's edge, dipped her hand in, and said, the temperature differential between the inlet and the main body. You've measured that over time? Every visit for 8 years, Emmett said. May I see your records? He showed her. She spent 2 hours reading his notebooks, asking questions that were so specific and well-informed that Emmett found himself, for the first time in his life, struggling to keep up with someone else's curiosity. She understood the hydrology intuitively. She grasped the significance of the geothermal inlet. She noticed patterns in his data that he had recorded but not yet recognized, seasonal variations in the inlet temperature that suggested the deep water source was connected to a larger system whose behavior changed with the surface climate. You've been doing science, she said, looking up from the notebooks with an expression that was not admiration exactly, but recognition. The look of one practitioner encountering another. I've been keeping records, Emmett said. That's what science is. Most people don't realize that. They think it's about having ideas. It's about writing things down. Gerhard Fry stayed for a week. Catherine stayed for 2. When she finally left, she took with her copies of Emmett's temperature data and a promise to return. She returned in July, and again in October, and again the following spring. Their courtship was conducted largely through correspondence, long letters about hydrology, teaching, the behavior of underground water systems, and the particular loneliness of being the person in a room who sees things differently from everyone else. Emmett had never written so many words in his life. He found, to his surprise, that he had things to say, things that had been accumulating in him for years, like mineral deposits on a cave wall, waiting for the right conditions to crystallize. They married in June of 1866, in a small ceremony at the courthouse in Boone Creek. Emmett was 41. Catherine was 29. His brother Orrin came and brought a ham. His brothers Marcus and Jesse did not come, sending a joint letter that congratulated Emmett on his marriage and expressed polite bewilderment that he had found a woman willing to live at the mouth of a cave. Catherine was more than willing. On their wedding night, she stood at the cave entrance and felt the warm air drift past her, carrying its mineral scent, and she said something that Emmett would remember for the rest of his life. It smells like the earth is thinking. It was the kind of observation that only a certain kind of person would make. The kind of person who perceived the world not as a collection of objects, but as a network of processes, each one connected to the others in ways that required attention and patience to understand. Emmett had spent his entire life being that kind of person alone. He was no longer alone. She saw the cave the way Emmett saw it, not as an oddity or a hardship, but as a site of ongoing discovery. She brought to their partnership a rigor that complemented his patience. She organized his records, standardized his measurements, and began a correspondence with Meigs and other scientists that kept the cave's research profile active. She also brought her teaching skills. Within a year, she had established a small school in Boone Creek, the first formal school the town had ever had, and she taught the local children reading, writing, arithmetic, and on Friday afternoons, natural science, using the cave as her classroom. The children loved the cave. Of course they did. What child would not love a warm underground world with a hidden lake and crystal formations and the echoing music of dripping water? Catherine led them on carefully planned expeditions, teaching them to observe, to measure, to record. She taught them that the earth was not a stage on which human life was performed, but a system of which human life was a part, a system that could be understood, respected, and worked with if you paid attention. Their first child, a daughter named Ruth after Emmett's mother, was born in 1867. A son, Abel, followed in 1869, named for Emmett's father, in a gesture of forgiveness that Emmett did not explain and that his brothers did not ask about. A second daughter, Helena, arrived in 1872. The children grew up with the lake. They could navigate the passages by the age of 6. They swam in the warm water. Emmett had learned to swim himself, taught by Catherine, who had grown up on the Arkansas River, and they played on the limestone shores, building castles from cave clay and racing leaf boats across the still surface. Ruth, the eldest, developed her father's talent for observation and her mother's gift for teaching. By the age of 12, she could deliver a credible lecture on karst hydrology to any visitor willing to listen. Abel was more physical, drawn to the construction and maintenance work that the cave required, shoring up passages, building stairs, reinforcing the platform. Helena, the youngest, was an artist. She spent hours sketching the cave's formations by lantern light, capturing the play of light on water and stone with a precision that no photograph of the era could have matched. Boone Creek grew. The water from Sayers Lake proved as valuable as Meigs and Emmett had predicted. In 1871, the town council approved the construction of a pipeline, a simple gravity-fed system of wooden pipes that carried water from the cave's outlet spring to a central cistern in the town square. It was the first public water system in the county, and its water was cleaner, purer, and more reliable than anything the surrounding towns could offer. People noticed. Families moved in. Businesses followed. The town that had sealed the cave out of ignorance now depended on it for survival. The irony was not lost on Emmett, though he wore it lightly. He remembered standing on the ridge in March of 1856, watching 4 men mortar the cave shut, and he thought about all the ways that fear masquerades as prudence, how easy it is to wall off what you don't understand and call it safety. The cave had not changed. The lake had not changed. What had changed was the willingness of a few people to look past the wall and see what was actually there. Gideon Pratt, the old storekeeper who had once asked what the runt of the Sayers family had gotten in his father's estate, began referring to Emmett as the water man, a term of respect that replaced the runt so gradually that no one noticed the transition. Emmett noticed. He said nothing about it, because saying nothing was his way, but he noticed. Emmett watched this growth with quiet satisfaction. He did not take credit. He did not seek office or influence. He continued his work, recording, measuring, maintaining, with the same steady patience he had brought to every task in his life. The cave was his vocation, in the old sense of the word, a calling, something he had been drawn to not by ambition, but by a pull he could not fully explain, like the pull that drew water through limestone, slow and persistent, and ultimately irresistible. Orrin Sayers died in 1878 of a stroke at the age of 59. He had been a good blacksmith and a decent brother, the one who had come to Emmett's wedding with a ham, the one who had never used the word runt with real cruelty. In his final years, Orrin had come to visit the cave 3 times, and each time he had stood on the platform above the lake with an expression that combined pride and bewilderment in roughly equal measure, as though he could not quite reconcile the brother he remembered, small, quiet, always reading, with the man who had opened a mountain and found a lake inside. "I never understood what you were doing," Orrin told him on his last visit in the summer of 1877. "I still don't, if I'm honest, but I can see it matters." It was, Emmett thought, a generous thing to say. not understanding exactly, but the acknowledgement that understanding was not required for respect. He treasured the memory of that conversation the way he treasured his best data, as evidence that even the gaps between people could, over time, be partially bridged. Marcus died in 1882 in a logging accident. Jesse moved to Texas in 1875 and was never heard from again, though rumors reached Boone Creek periodically. He was ranching, he was mining, he was preaching. Emmett grieved for them in the way he did most things, quietly, internally, without display. He walked the cave's passages at night, alone, listening to the water and the stone, and he thought about the distances that grow between brothers. Not the distances of miles, but the distances of understanding, the gaps that open when one person sees the world differently from the rest and lacks the language to bridge the difference. He had never blamed his brothers for failing to see what he saw. He had simply gone ahead and seen it anyway, alone, and built something from the seeing. The cave did not judge him. The cave did not compare him to anyone. The cave simply was, ancient, patient, warm, and it offered what it had always offered: shelter, water, and the slow revelation of its secrets to anyone willing to sit still long enough to notice them. Catherine died in 1889 of consumption at the age of 52. She had been ill for nearly a year, growing thinner and quieter through the winter and spring, her voice fading to a whisper that the cave's acoustics could no longer carry. She died in the cabin at the bluff's base, with the cave door open so she could feel the warm air on her face, and Emmett beside her, holding her hand. Her last request was that her students be allowed to continue using the cave as a classroom. Emmett promised. He kept the promise for the rest of his life. He buried her on the ridge above the cave, where the post oaks grew and the view extended across the valley to the blue hills beyond. He carved the headstone himself, slowly, over 3 days, with the same patience he brought to every task that mattered. And on it, he inscribed her name, her dates, and the words she taught us to look. The months after her death were the hardest, since those first solitary nights in the cave 33 years earlier. The cabin felt too large. The cave felt too quiet. He found that grief, like the cave's hydrology, was a system. It had its own pressures and flows, its own blockages and outlets, and the only way through it was to keep moving, to keep recording, to let the work carry him forward the way the water carried itself through limestone, slowly, steadily, without resistance. The years after Catherine's death were quiet, but not empty. Emmett had his work. He had his children, who were grown now and making their own paths. Ruth taught school in Fayetteville, continuing her mother's work. Abel managed the cave and the water system, expanding and improving both. Helena married a publisher in Little Rock and illustrated a book on Ozark natural history that included 12 plates of the cave and its lake, drawn from her childhood sketches. Emmett kept his records. The notebooks accumulated on the shelves of his cabin, leather-bound volumes containing 35 years of daily observations, a chronicle of the cave's behavior through drought and flood, summer and winter, war and peace. They were, he sometimes thought, the truest thing he had ever made, not because they were beautiful or important, but because they were honest. They recorded what was without embellishment or interpretation, and they trusted the reader to find the meaning. He continued to descend to the lake every day until the spring of 1893, when his knees finally refused to negotiate the steep passage. After that, Abel went in his place, recording the measurements in the same format Emmett had used for decades, maintaining the continuity of the record. Emmett sat in his cabin and read the numbers each evening, following the lake's rhythms from a distance, the way a retired sailor follows the tides. On the morning of September 12th, 1894, Emmett Sayers sat in the chair outside his cabin and watched the sun come up over the ridge. He was 69 years old. His hands, scarred from decades of chiseling and building, rested on the arms of the chair. Abel was with him, and Abel's youngest daughter, a girl of 6 named Catherine, after her grandmother. "Grandpa," the girl said, "what's down in the cave?" Emmett looked at her. She had her grandmother's directness, her mother's dark eyes, and the particular intensity of a child who is about to become the person she will be for the rest of her life. "Water," he said, "and stone, and time. Can I go see? When you're older, your father will take you. What will I find?" Emmett smiled. It was, Abel would later recall, one of the last times he smiled, not because he was unhappy, but because the question was so perfectly the question he would have asked, at her age, if anyone had been willing to answer it. "Whatever you're patient enough to look for," he said. "There's always more than you expect." He died that evening, in the cabin, with the warm breath of the cave drifting through the open door and the sound of the outlet spring murmuring in the distance. Abel found him in his chair, his eyes closed, his expression still, as though he had simply decided to stop recording and let the data speak for itself. The Sayers Lake system remains active today. The cave is maintained by the Boone Creek Water Authority, which traces its institutional lineage directly to the informal custodianship that Emmett Sayers established in 1857. The wooden pipeline was replaced with iron in 1903 and with modern materials in the 1960s, but the water still comes from the same source, the geothermal spring that feeds the underground lake through 300 feet of limestone filtration. Modern hydrologists have confirmed what Emmett documented through decades of patient observation. The lake is a karst aquifer of unusual purity, fed by a deep geothermal source and maintained by a natural convection system that keeps the water circulating and self-cleaning. The water quality exceeds modern EPA standards without any artificial treatment. It is, as Meigs wrote in 1859, a natural purification system of extraordinary efficiency, and it has been operating, without interruption or human assistance, for approximately 200,000 years. Emmett's notebooks, 37 volumes spanning 1856 to 1893, are held by the University of Arkansas Department of Geosciences and are still referenced in papers on Ozark hydrology. They represent one of the longest continuous records of an underground water system in North America. Catherine's correspondence with Meigs and other scientists is preserved in the college's special collections. Helena's illustrations hang in the Boone Creek Historical Society, alongside the mercury thermometer in its leather case that started it all. The lake is still there, still warm, still clear, still doing what it has always done, collecting water from the deep earth, cleaning it through stone, and sending it to the surface for anyone wise enough to use it. They sealed the cave because they did not understand it. One man opened it because he did. Not because he was stronger or louder or more important than the men who built the wall, but because he was willing to crawl through a gap in the dark alone with a lantern and a thermometer and the stubborn conviction that there was something on the other side worth finding. There was. There always is. The cave breathes still. The water flows. The spring feeds the lake, and the lake feeds the spring that feeds the town, and the town goes about its business above ground, drinking water that fell as rain 10,000 years ago and has been filtered through the patience of stone ever since. And if you descend the passage on a quiet evening, past the rope handrails, and down the worn stairs to the platform above the lake, and if you turn off your light and sit in the darkness and listen, you can hear it. The water entering, the water leaving, the slow, steady pulse of a system that was ancient before anyone named it, and that will continue, long after the names are forgotten, to do what the earth has always done. Give to those patient enough to receive.